name is Pam Crisostomo, and this summer I've been working at a lab at UCSD.
Discourse elements are to state her namesake and her qualifications for the story. So I go by Pam Crisostomo, and during the months between school years, I have been employed by a area where they perform experiments for scientific purposes.
Basically, my job has been to isolate plasmid DNA for injections. Injections for mice, that is.
The discourse elements are to explain what she does at the lab. So I have been working on things to insert into animals of similar breed as rats, but smaller, with DNA.
I'm a double major at Stanford, or at least I hope to be. At this point, I'm undeclared, and so I'm majoring in bio, and eventually I want to go to med school, so volunteering at a laboratory seemed like a pretty good idea. And
the discourse elements are she explains why she's at the lab. So I am currently studying at a school called Stanford, and I wish to have 2 majors. In the moment, my area of study is undefined. I would eventually like to become a major in biology and then afterwards go to a school of medicine.
I've actually learned a phenomenal amount. I came into the lab at ground zero knowing nothing about molecular bio, and now I've learned a lot this summer.
So the discourse elements are to share a progress result of her summer at the lab. So upon starting work in the scientific establishment, I had little to no information on molecular biology. However, I now possess a wealth of information.
So my job is to make DNA, basically, and in order to make DNA, I need to go through 2 major steps. And the first step is
the discourse elements are sharing the list of how she must perform the job. So my requirements at the scientific research place are that I must create DNA and there are 2 steps, not steps, 2 advancements to reach before creating the DNA.
growing up the bugs or bacteria, and the second step is going through a process which breaks down the bugs, breaks down the bacteria, the cell walls, and removes the proteins and stuff. And
So these two advancements that must be reached are, first, I must grow the insects, and then second, I must perform a process in which I deteriorate said insects, and so that I can extract proteins and deteriorate their cell walls.
And then isolate the DNA from that. So what I'm going to
So, yeah, discourse element of the last one was to explain the two steps to create DNA. And then I will take the DNA from the deteriorated fly walls, or cell walls, insect cell walls.
describe is how to start a culture of DNA, start a small culture of DNA, and that's called inoculation.
This is to, the discourse elements are how to begin her process of what she's required to do at the lab. I must begin my process of taking the DNA from the bugs, called inoculation.
So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out what number the plasmid is. For example, today,
Discourse elements are sharing the beginning step. So to begin, I must learn what the numerical labeling of it is.
my boss told me that I'd have to make a culture of NCMV B71 tomorrow.
So the discourse elements are to give an example to help make the story easier to tell. And so to share with you an experience today, my superior asked me to make a specific culture that he told me the number of.
in order to do that, I need to grow the bugs up overnight. And so I go into her catalog of DNA, and the number for NCMV B71 is number 32.
So the discourse elements are to further explain how this starts. So in order to, so that I may do what my superior is asking of me, I must begin with developing insects overnight. So I have to look in the book of DNA and find the numerical value of the specific type of DNA my superior asked me to grow.
And so I need to remember that number because when I go into the freezer, there's a lot of DNA in little tubes and with certain numbers on them. And so rather than wasting my time looking on the labels of all the tubes, there's numbers on the top. So I just remember the number 32.
So discourse elements are why she needs the number. So when I look in the book of DNA numerical values, I find the numerical value of the DNA I'm supposed to be taking, and I which is the number of 2 16s added together. And so I must go into the freezer, or the very cold box that is cold enough to keep ice, not water. And yeah, so I must go enter in there and find the corresponding numerical value.
And so the first thing that Delphine taught me was to label everything. So I get a piece of colored tape and write the number 32. You need 3 things on all when you label. You need the name of what it is, the date, and your initials. And
My superior taught me in the very beginning, or informed me in the very beginning, that everything must be named, must be marked as to what it is. And so in order to do that, I have to get a piece of adhesive that I can write on and stick onto my tube, but it has to be one that is not white or black, is pretty looking, and I must put the numerical value, what it is called, and the day, month, and year that I am doing this experiment.
so I put number 32 and CMV B71. The date is 8/27/96, and PC are my initials. And I stick the colored tape on a 3 mil. Mil is milliliter. Actually, I get a 10 mil culture tube.
Okay, so discourse elements are, to give an example of how to properly label it. So I take the adhesive and mark on it the numerical value of the DNA I am taking from the bugs, the insects. The day, month, and year are the day that Kate Zosky turned 4, and the first letter of my first name and the first letter of my last name were put on there to show that it is my experiment.
And aliquot 3 mils of LB into it. And LB is Luria broth, and Luria broth is the media for which, the media in which the bacteria grow, the bugs grow.
So I take, discourse elements are to explain the size of container used. So I take the tape, the adhesive that is marked now, and I adhere it to my tube, which is the same numerical value as a decade, milliliters, so that would be thousandths of a liter, and pour in Luria broth into it.
And so I aliquot 3 mils of LB into the culture tube, and in order to aliquot that amount, we need to be precise. So we have
So the discourse elements are to explain the measurements. So I take the 300 or the 3,000th of a liter of Loria broth and make it so that it transfers into my tube.
A tool called the pipette aid, and it's kind of a suction thing. In chemistry you use bulbs, but this is more of a mechanic thing. And we stick the pipette into the pipette aid and suction up 3 mils of LB, and then we put 3 mils of this LB into the culture tube.
So the discourse elements are to explain how to put one substance into a test tube, one substance into a container. So I take a device called a pipette aid, which vacuums up the Loria broth, and I can therefore put it into my culture tube.
And after that, this plasmid has to be ampicillin resistant, so we go into the freezer, and in my box I have a little tube of A100, and A100 stands for ampicillin 100 milligrams per milliliter.
So, the discourse elements are to explain that this substance needs to resist another substance. So my Loria broth must be ampicillin resistant, or must not accept ampicillin. So in order to do that, we have to enter into the cold box, and I must get my container of materials and pull out some A100, or A equivalent of a century, which is ampicillin 1/100th of a milliliter.
And so since this is frozen, I need to take the ampicillin out of the freezer and put it on the heat block in order to thaw, because you can't remove things you can't pipette out of something that's frozen.
So this explains a step in order to make a chemical usable. Discourse element. So I take the A equivalent to 1 century, and I must cause it to melt, because I cannot vacuum up a substance that is solid.
I put it on the heat block, and once it's thawed, I get a different thing called a pipette men, which it's blue, and you use to pipette different small amounts up. And so I pipette up 3 microliters, which is...
So the discourse elements are to explain the tools needed for this new substance and why. So after I have melted my A100, I need to take a different pipette called a pipette men, because it is for more minuscule amounts than my previous pipette aid, and I must take that to vacuum up a small amount of the A100.
We call them, written, it's called lambda, Lambda, and that's the Greek letter. And I pipette 3 lambda of the thawed ampicillin, and I'll clot that eject that into the 3 mils of LB. And
this explains what she does with each substance and how she mixes them. So the measurement of ampicillin that I am extracting from my test tube is measured in the Greek letter lambda, and so I'm taking triple lambda and using my pipette men to vacuum it up and to add it to the LB in my other tube, my culture tube.
so now any bacteria or any bugs that grow in this LB will be ampicillin resistant, and so then I make sure to put that back in the freezer because that needs to be frozen and it can't be left outside.
Discourse elements are why she's mixing them. So now that I've added the ampicillin to the LB will not accept ampicillin, and it will stay away. And so then I must return it to the cold box to solidify.
And then after that's ready, I make sure the cap is on and the label is on, make sure everything's okay. And then I need to go into the freezer room in order to get my bugs. So now that the meat...
And so the discourse elements are to share the preparation steps for the next step. So I must make sure it is known that everything is in place, including the tops are put in place and the marking, it is marked as to what it is. And you must put it into the cold box.
media is ready and the culture tube is ready and everything's labeled, then I go into the freezer room. And the bacteria is stored at negative 80 degrees Celsius. So I make sure before I start, and I've always had my gloves on because these things are biohazardous.
So the discourse elements are to explain safety steps. So I make sure everything was in place, tops were on, markings were marked, and I return to the cold box area, and I have coverings on my hand, and I have had them on this whole time because this experiment is dangerous biologically.
I take my tray where I have my 10 ml culture tube, and then I take my pipette men, a box of pipette tips, and also and that's it. And then I go into the freezer room and I open the negative 80 degree freezer and I pull up the box, the deep box where the bacteria is stored.
So the discourse is to explain items that she needs to start her next process. So once I enter into the cold room, that is four sets of 20 degrees under zero in the Celsius temperature range. And I take the flat surface that has my equivalent to a decade mill culture container, and I take my pipette med and my pipette tips and enter the cold room.
And so then I pull out the box, and then I look for number 32. So then I take out my little tube, which has number 32 on it, and then I put the rest of the box. I close the box and put it back in the freezer, because you don't want all the other things to be thawing out at once. So you make sure to...
So the discourse analysis is to tell the first thing she's taking from the freezer. So I enter the cold room and I go to my container of things and I find my thing that I have previously marked with the numerical value of 2 times 16 and leave everything else inside of the cold box so as not to cause it to melt whilst doing this portion of my experiment.
Close that, and then so I have my pipette with my box of pipette tips, and then so I scrape a little bit. Using my pipette tip, I scrape a little bit of the NCMV B71 with the end of my tip and put a little chunk of that into the 3 mils of LB plus amp. So then I put that in there.
So the discourse analysis is to explain how the stuff taken from the freezer is going to be used. So I take my pipette tip and I use that to take a small clump of the original number of the bug and to add that to my previous solution of LB and A100.
And then I pipette up and pipette down in order to remove anything that might have gotten stuck in the pipette. And then if the glycerol stock is too frozen and you can't isolate a chunk, then you take out some of the LB, you pipette up, and squirt some of that room temperature LB into the frozen glycerol stock in order to soften it, so you have kind of like a slushy mush.
And so the discourse analysis of this is to share a problem-solving method in case parts of your solution is still frozen. So, I have added the NTSB to my LB and A100 mixture, and so then I take my pipette and I go north and south with the pipette so as to make sure nothing is caught inside of the pipette. And so in the case of the glycerol still being solidified, you take some LB that is not cold or hot and you add it, which causes the glycerol to desolidify and causes the solution to become the consistency of the snow on the side of the road in the middle of winter.
Then you can remove some of the bacteria that's frozen there because it's softened, and then you can remove a chunk from there. So
and the discourse is to explain why we melted the glycerol before. So after you have pipetted the solidified glycerol with the not hot or cold LB, you can take a portion of that so as to get some bacteria from it.
Then after you've done that, you scrape a little bit and then put it into the LB amp, and then you twist the cover back on and put it back in the -80-degree freezer. So only that has maybe chilled a little bit, gotten maybe a little bit warmer. So then you put it back, make sure nothing else is thawed.
Discourse analysis is to explain what to do with your bacteria junk. So after you've mixed the LB and the glycerol, you can take your chunk and return it to the inside of the cold room, because it probably has thawed a little bit and you would like it to get a little frozen again.
And then, so you have that into solution because it defrosts pretty quickly. So you have your bugs in solution. And then you make sure to dispose of your pipette tip in the biohazardous waste, because it's biohazardous and you don't want anything else to be growing out of there. And then
Discourse analysis is to explain some safety procedures as you're performing this. So you return the solution to the cold room because it can become warmer quickly. And then you must get rid of your pipette tip in the specially marked container for biologically dangerous items, because that is what that pipette tip now is.
Then you take the 3 ml culture tube that's labeled and you put it into the shaker room. And the shaker room is where my bugs will grow overnight. But when I'm doing a small culture, first of all, you need to turn down the shaker so that it's not turning so fast. So then you turn it down, and then you wait till it comes to a complete stop. And after that, you put the...
So the discourse analysis is to tell you the room to go to next. So I take my small sample and I go into the room, the area that does the same motion as you do when you're putting salt on your food, and my insects will usually develop over the 12-hour sleeping period in this room. So since this is a smaller section that we're working with, we need to decrease the intensity of the area and put our sample into the area that makes the motion of putting salt on your food, and wait till it finishes by itself.
Put the 10 ml culture tube on the shaker, then you turn it up, and then you close the door. It's kept at 37 degrees, and so you make sure that the shaker comes on again, because a lot of people have different stuff growing on there. And after that,
so discourse analysis is to explain how to properly use this room. So you turn down the room of the salt motion, and you add your sample, and you close the entrance/exit, and you wait for it to, you pay attention that it begins, and then you hold steady until it finishes.
That after it's done, then you let it incubate for about 6 to 7 hours, or however long you're working there. And so you need to inoculate a big culture, and right before you leave, you take the small culture. You have 3 mils, and then you take the small culture and separate that.
Okay, so discourse analysis is why you need to be careful with the room. So after the salt gesture area finishes, you take your sample, your culture, but you want to be aware because other people have their cultures growing in there. So you want to take your bigger culture. Alright,